Hi again, everybody, and welcome to this evening's free virtual program. My name is Martha Waldron, and I am the Community Engagement Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We are very excited to host our friends and partners at Goucher College to share their work on the Hallowed Ground project, which has been partially informed by material in MCHC's Furlong Baldwin Library. The library and the research opportunities it presents is one of the gems of our institution. There are many other institutions today, like Goucher, other educational institutions, as well as businesses and other organizations that are exploring their roots and their beginnings. Libraries such as ours are places that can illuminate that history. So whether you are conducting scholarly research, delving into your own family history, or simply looking to learn more about Maryland people, places, and events, the Furlong Baldwin Library is an incredible collection of primary and secondary source materials waiting for you, and a truly wonderful staff who are available to assist. Information about visiting the library to conduct research is on our website, which is www.mdhistory.org. I also want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us tonight. We're going to be leaving some time at the end of the program to answer questions from you all. So feel free to use the Q&A feature throughout if a question arises, and we'll get to that at the end of the program. Without further ado, I'm going to turn off my mic and pass it over to James Dator, who is an associate professor of history at Goucher College, who will introduce the Hallowed Ground project.
Great, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you. I just really want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. It's so inspiring that you've taken time out of your evening, maybe even dinner time, to learn about some of our preliminary work on the history of slavery on the land that Goucher occupies today. So before I begin, I really want to offer sincere thanks to a few different groups. First and foremost, and without a doubt, I want to thank all the members of the Goucher community who have worked on or supported the research on the history of the land and the college, especially the students. There's simply too many students in particular to thank. Second, I really want to offer my deep thanks to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I should say I'm not a historian of Maryland, but working with Kate, David, and Martha, and everyone else at MCHC has really been such a pleasure that sometimes I really wish I was a historian of Maryland. And finally, I want to thank the Council for Independent Colleges Humanity Research for the Public Good initiative, which kindly supported this work. For those of you who do not know, the Hallowed Ground project began several years ago after Goucher students began to ask questions about the history of the social landscape in Towson and the role that slavery played on it. As a historian of the colonial Caribbean, I was new to all of this information, but I listened and I learned, and I realized that I learned that the college had purchased the land in 1921, and that this had a much longer history that was deeply intertwined with the massive plantation complex now known as the Hampton National Historic Site. Hampton was owned by the powerful Ridgely family as far back as 1745. Successive Ridgely patriarchs parceled off land to less established family members who also kept enslaved men, women, and children. We believe that the first time this happens on the site where Goucher is now located happened in 1772, when Charles Ridgely II died and willed his grandson, John Robert Holliday, land that Holliday called Epsom Plantation. Notably, Ridgely also bequeathed Holliday one enslaved woman. Her name was Jean. Two things were clear right away. When students learned that the landscape had once been the site of a plantation, they felt a painful mix of emotions. The second was that even though there had been waves of students who had researched aspects of the history under the directions of Professors Kent Lancaster and Tina Scheller, the broader institution had never really elevated that amazing work so that it could stick in our collective memory. That work existed in paper notes stored in chaotic folios in our library archives, and came alive in Scheller's illuminating work with students. Yet as a community, as an institution, we somehow overlooked that this history would always be indelibly connected to our present. It was literally underneath our feet. Institutional memory is a powerful thing. Powerful still is institutional forgetting. It is for this reason that we name the project Hallowed Ground. To hallow something is to venerate it, to respect it greatly. To forget something is to disregard it, to plow it into the past. Of course, for the enslaved people, convict laborers, and indentured servants who once labored on the land, the site that became known as Epsom was certainly not a place to venerate. But that's precisely why we work to remember what happened there today, in the present. As a college, the Hallowed Ground Project asks that we never again forget what happened to people who labored on that landscape long before the college moved to Towson. Months ago, Debbie Harner and I set out working with four students, Kalman Bokow, Layla Murray, Sylvie Rude, and Joey Reisberg, with a very narrow mission. First and foremost, we wanted to document as many names of people who experienced enslavement at Epsom in the 18th century as we could. Although Kent Lancaster and his students had done considerable work on Hampton, and while Tina Scheller and her students had unearthed mounds of information about Epsom when it belonged to the Chew family, we still knew very little about the people enslaved by John Robert Holliday, who named the plantation and owned it from 1772 until his death in 1800. While some names were scattered in Lancaster's notes, there were gaps in information and no exhaustive study of Holliday's holdings or business transactions was conducted. We hoped our effort would lead us forward into future research, as finding names of the enslaved might allow us to trace family lines. Our long-term goal, after all, is to build a memorial in their honor. But in simple terms, our first mission was simply to figure out what could be found at MCHC's archives and to collect as many names as we could along the way. Ultimately, the research was student-driven, but guided by Debbie and myself. Debbie's going to talk a little bit more about process at the end, and Joey and Kalman are going to discuss what they've learned. But before they begin, I want to say a little bit about what I've learned from their wonderful work. As I began to comb through the students' findings, I began to see the power of our archival research in a new way. My first surprise was not just how hard it was to find names, but how difficult it was to find concrete information about Holliday that could lead us to new names. Holliday, as Kalman and Joey note in their presentations, was a kind of middling figure who lived in the shadow of the powerful Ridgely family. There are few, if any, records at MCHC written in his own hand, and those documents that relate to him are filed in the massive Ridgely collection. Holliday's entire career as a small plantation owner, slave keeper, horse trader, sheriff, and overseer of Epsom Lime Works depended on the fact that he was born to the daughter of a Ridgely patriarch. Hence, we find a copy of Holliday's will not in his own collection in the archives, but stashed away in Ridgely papers. Thanks to notes from Kent Lancaster, we're able to track this will down. Yet even here we have a mystery. Although Holliday was tax assessed to be in possession of 29 individuals in 1798, his will of 1800 only names 11 individuals, noting simply that, quote, all others were to go to his son and namesake, John Robert Holliday, Jr. The 11 names are noted here: Rachel, Suck, Prudence, Rosetta, Cassandra, Evelina, Charity, Hosea, Mortimer, Abraham, and Leah. As the students continued to comb through the records at MCHC, I started getting worried. So I began to branch out a little more, and one day I searched the Maryland State Archives Orphan Court records, which are sort of like probate records. It was there that I found a microfilm copy of a petition filed by one John Yiser in 1803, pictured here on the left. Upon Holliday's death, Yiser was appointed to be the custodian of Holliday's daughter, Mary. Yiser was suing John Robert Holliday, Jr. because Jr. refused to turn over an enslaved child named Charity. As we can see from Holliday's will on the right, Holliday bequeathed Charity to the adolescent Mary, but Charity did not follow Mary to Yiser, as property law would have required. Instead, Holliday Jr. kept Charity, but we have no idea why. All we know is that Yiser sued to get possession of Charity. This led me to my second revelation. As my mind dwelled on Charity's unknown fate, I began to realize how the archive itself reflected both the power and precarity of family in the age of slavery in Maryland. In some ways, it was as if Charity and Holliday's cases were distorted reflections of one another. Charity's name only appears in the archive because of the wealth she conferred to Holliday's children. Holliday had only arisen to power as a property holder because he was the son of a Ridgely heir. Had Holliday's powerful family connections not existed, we might never be able to track down Holliday's will. And yet, had it not been but for Holliday's decision to bequeath Charity to Mary, we might never know of Charity at all. In short, the power of Holliday's family to be traced in the archive marked out Charity's precarious relationship to her own family. For me, this made the history much more personal and difficult to consider. Power and family was a powerful thing for Holliday, and yet we can only imagine what family must have meant to Charity, whose connections with her kin and family always hung in the balance. In conclusion, I would say that Charity's case should remind us how powerful archives are in our society. Archives like MCHC are not just powerful because they reflect the legacy of elites like the Ridgeleys, but also because they hold, oftentimes by happenstance, the silent stories of people like Charity. Had it not been for the library at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, we might never have learned about Charity and been able to remember her today. Now, I'll leave room for discussion at the end of our presentation, and next up is Joey Reisberg, who studied the changing economic and social landscape of captivity in and around Epsom during the late 18th century.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Our story begins in 1775 with this newspaper advertisement. A convict laborer who formerly worked for John Robert Holliday escaped from the ironworks he was bound to and was suspected of joining the British cause during the Revolutionary War. And this was William Springs, who has talked much lately of joining Gage's party. Thomas Gage was a British military commander in the area, and William Springs was suspected of joining his band. In addition to spelling an end for white indentured labor, the Revolutionary War gave enslaved people new leverage as the planter class split between patriots and loyalists, and hundreds of enslaved people used the chaos of war to escape from chattel slavery. Although the free population grew tremendously during this time period, so did the number of enslaved people in Maryland. There was no neat linear progression of fewer enslaved as more years went on, even though the center of United States slavery shifted to the cotton-growing South rather than the tobacco-producing Chesapeake after the Revolutionary War. The economic catastrophe of the war prompted the shift from tobacco to wheat production in Maryland, and this less labor-intensive crop opened the door to a changing form of slavery in the region. Term slavery became much more common during the slack times of the wheat growing year. Enslaved people were hired out for a specific number of years, and these kinds of gradual manumissions eventually led to Maryland and Virginia having the largest free Black community of the antebellum United States. Urban areas became centers of freedom and self-sufficiency for a generation newly freed of slavery. But just because there was a division between free and enslaved doesn't mean that these groups were kept apart. There were many families of mixed status. For example, a woman serving out a term of 25 years living in the same house with a free man. In fact, this is a significant reason why many freed slaves did not go north. They were bound to the South by family and employment opportunity. Baltimore did not just appeal to residents alone. In the words of Seth Rockman, delivering agricultural produce to the city gave many rural slaves a familiarity with Baltimore that proved useful when running away. Scholars at the Maryland Center for History and Culture have done amazing work with visualizing early Baltimore, including this aerial view of Baltimore in the early 19th century. They show that diverse communities of working class alleys like Strawberry Alley and Fells Point were wedged between the higher rent main streets and formed self-sufficient communities of laborers. Free Black people in particular formed close mutual aid networks to support themselves, after many came directly from plantations on the Eastern Shore with very little money or training in an employable craft. Those who were still serving a term of enslavement had some degree of leverage. For example, an 1809 sale of a 26-year-old woman said that, quote, she has a husband in the city, Therefore, none need apply that don't want her services at or near this place. Additionally, enslaved men who were hired out temporarily faced some protection from more dangerous types of employment, like dredging out the muck from the harbor basin, because of the high risk of injury or disease. The mainly anonymous labor of these people, free and unfree, or in a kind of legal gray zone, turned Baltimore into an economic boomtown and the nation's third largest city by the early 19th century. In the words of the Oxford African American Studies Center, with virtually no colonial era past to set the tone of its early republic development, Baltimore embodied the ambitions and limitations of the new United States. Baltimore's meteoric rise was made possible by a network of economic and political connections with the large plantations in the surrounding countryside. These connections included downtown leather suppliers outfitting the indentured and enslaved workers with shoes, or enslaved men who lived among free people in the city being temporarily sold to local farms or quarries. Some of the most influential men in the more cosmopolitan world of Baltimore and its municipal politics only lived temporarily in the more settled parts of town and spent most of their time lording over plantations that more resembled those on the Eastern Shore in terms of scale and control over the enslaved population. Such was the case with John Robert Holliday, who is involved in our story today. Holliday Street is named after him, its location next to City Hall most likely adjacent to where Holliday enters history books as High Sheriff of Baltimore County from 1770 to 1774. Holliday's election to the office was shrouded in controversy, as there were reports of trickery and misfiled information on his election paperwork, and perhaps nepotism, as his stepfather was High Sheriff before he was. During the Revolutionary War, which spurred Baltimore's rapid and diverse growth, Holliday was an officer in the Back River Upper 100 Battalion of the area around present-day Towson and Loch Raven. Holliday's connection with the changing post-Revolutionary War slave trade begins in 1772, when he inherits a tract of land from Colonel Charles Ridgely. The Ridgeleys were somewhat of an anomaly in north-central Maryland. In an area of mainly industrial and term slavery, they ran a plantation more similar to those that could be found in the agricultural areas of southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore. Their reliance on white indentured servants was made unproductive by the Revolutionary War, and they switched instead to enslaved labor. By 1790, there were over 300 enslaved people among the various Ridgely residences and properties. In the words of an ethnographic report on Hampton National Historic Site, these holdings included orchards, ironworks, coal mining, marble and limestone quarries, mills, and mercantile interests, all fueled and supported by enslaved workers. Enslaved workers were also cooks, laundresses, and midwives, dairymaids and needleworkers, and attended to the personal demands of the family. John Robert Holliday's portion of this vast prize was called Epsom, the site of present-day Goucher College. Colonel Charles Ridgely was known for separating families of enslaved people. He signed away 38 enslaved people among his descendants in his will, only some of whom stayed to work the land at Epsom, which was primarily an agricultural site. Enslaved workers at Epsom produced cereal crops, dairy products, and livestock sold at the major markets in Baltimore City like Lexington or Broadway markets. Over 31 enslaved people were needed to operate the nearby Northampton Ironworks during the time of Holliday's residence at Epsom. Epsom itself had a lime kiln built by Holliday and operated by enslaved laborers. This kiln remains one of the only physical remnants of the time period left at Goucher. Kent Lancaster, professor and one of the original researchers of Epsom, describes the kiln as, quote, nestled inconspicuously in a campus gully. Industrial ventures such as the Northampton Ironworks and the lime kiln were the foundation of the Ridgely wealth. During the Revolutionary War, they started out by supplying the British with pig iron, but soon switched sides in order to reap the profits from the Continental Army. Starting in the Revolutionary era, far ahead of the regional trend, Northampton Ironworks became a mixed site of employment between convict laborers, indentured servants, and enslaved people. Benefits of this new economy were overwhelmingly for men, as they could be much more mobile in seeking short-term employment. Industrial work had mixed effects on the well-being of enslaved people. Although the work was more flexible and workers had more bargaining power, the conditions were still brutal, and short-term enslaved workers at Hampton complained of being given rotten meat and other indignities. This new economy linked city and country even more closely for enslaved people. In order to clear the land around the Gunpowder River where the Ridgely family had most of their holdings, they transported about a dozen enslaved men daily from Ridgely's Delight, a neighborhood by the harbor, 10 miles north to the rural areas. Such an arrangement, although time-consuming and difficult for the enslaved men, was preferable than being sold far away from family and friends, as most of their wives and other female relatives were confined to domestic service. Although runaway communities formed in Baltimore, most found freedom by waiting out a term, and as many as 1/3 of all enslaved people advertised for sale in Baltimore at the turn of the 19th century had a term limit that was specified in the text of their advertisement. As inheritor of a large farm and ironworks, John Robert Holliday was tasked with tracking missing indentured servants and enslaved workers. There are dozens of reports of runaways from Ridgely land in the Revolutionary period and immediately after. Oftentimes, convict laborers and indentured servants would escape together, but there are no records of runaways crossing the racial divide to escape with Black enslaved people from Hampton or any of the industrial operations. Ultimately, John Robert Holliday did not have much of a career change. He was accustomed to being a catcher of slaves from his role as High Sheriff of Baltimore. Some of the only archival traces left by Holliday are his advertisements for these runaways from Epsom or Northampton ironworks. Especially during the Revolutionary period, most of these runaways were convict laborers, and there is one from 1771 that states, quote, "He may very probably try to pass himself as a soldier and deserter with the British." Other convicts escaped with clothes or even cash. But this next advertisement comes from decades later, when slavery had almost totally replaced white indentured labor. What's significant in this advertisement from 1796 is that the runaway is suspected of going to join his family members in Annapolis, who were still enslaved. Although the mixed status communities of these Chesapeake cities like Baltimore or Annapolis could safely shelter some runaway communities, Tim, who called himself James, took a tremendous risk by returning to where it was known he had enslaved family members. An advertisement like this one shows the cruel extent slavery had on determining people's movements and lives during this time period. And now Kalman Bokow is going to share another specific document that sheds light on the life of John Robert Holliday and those who worked for him.
Thank you so much, Joey. I'd like to say that the library of the Maryland Center for History and Culture was very useful to us during our research for the Hallowed Ground project. However, there was one document we found in the library that gave us a little more insight than some others. I believe it was Debbie that found this bill of sale. Dated the 24th of July, 1785, it shows us a man named Archibald Buchanan selling several enslaved African Americans to Holliday and John McClure. There are 15 people listed in the document, and all of them are named. This is useful to us because when we set out to do our research for Hallowed Ground, one of the things we wanted was the names of the enslaved people who used to live and work on the campus that we live and work on now. Names are something obviously important to us as human beings. What we choose to call ourselves, or what others choose to call us, is central to our lives and our identities. Thus, it was crucial that we find the names of these people. So, as a sign of respect, I will read their names now, along with the ages they were sold at, so we all have a chance to hear and recognize them. Bet, 50 years old. Press, 23 years old. Sal, 18 years old. Hezekiah, 20 years old. Nathaniel, 14 years old. Rosetta, 11 years old. Osmond, 6 years old. Matilda, 4 years old. Caesar, 3 years old. Alfonso, 4 months old. Edmund, 6 years old. Nan, 20 years old. And Indiana, 2 years old. Several questions are immediately generated by this document. First off, why were these people bought by McClure and Holliday? Why were they all so young? Are they grouped by their mothers? Well, we can't answer all these questions. We can give you some background to this document and perhaps get a little closer to an answer. First, some details about Buchanan. He was a prominent, wealthy Baltimore merchant. He was involved in a number of different industries, some industrial such as shipbuilding. He was involved in several public trade disputes and was also a merchant throughout the Revolutionary War. At one point, seeking permission from George Washington himself to travel to New York, perhaps across enemy lines, to attend to personal business. He was also, curiously enough, an actor, having performed in a rendition of Cato in February 1785. He died just a few short months later, having auctioned off much of his property as he was in severe debt. It is from one of these auctions that this bill of sale originates. After he died, his wife, Sarah Buchanan, in mourning, named their mansion Timonium Mansion after the incomplete palace in Greece where Mark Antony committed suicide. This is where the name of Timonium, Maryland originates. While as a prominent merchant, much is known about Buchanan, comparatively little is known about McClure. We know that he was a merchant, but probably not as prominent as Buchanan. He traded internationally, which probably meant he was of some importance and usually in luxury goods, such as liquors and cigars. Other than that, we know little about McClure, including which of the enslaved people, if any, he bought. Why would Buchanan, McClure, and Holliday be in business together? The easy answer to the question is that they were all prominent Baltimore businessmen. We have proof that Buchanan and McClure were not only very wealthy, but also traded internationally beyond the borders of what is now the United States. While Holliday was also quite wealthy compared to most, he lived in the shadows of the Ridgely family. We can make an educated guess that doing business with McClure and particularly Buchanan was a way to increase his status in society and among the rich of Baltimore. Why did Holliday buy slaves from Buchanan? We do not really know, but we can speculate that they were to either be traded or to work or then live on Epsom or one of Holliday's other properties. The disturbing and confusing part is that these slaves are almost all children and seem to be organized on the bill of sale by their mother. Now, this is confusing given the industrial nature of Epsom, including the lime kiln and the forge previously mentioned by Joey, which are used in the iron making process. So that meant that those who worked in such industrial areas were almost always single men. So why would Holliday even be interested in the purchase of women and children? We can make a few guesses. Perhaps Holliday was in debt himself to McClure and helped him buy these people to pay it off. Holliday might also have been interested in the sale so he could resell the enslaved people again and try and turn a profit. It's also possible that Holliday wanted these women and children to be domestic slaves, perhaps working in the Epsom mansion. There are some quite obvious limitations to this bill of sale. First off, we don't know which slaves were bought by Holliday and which were bought by McClure. This is an issue because it impacts the relevance of the primary source to us. For example, we do not even know if any of the enslaved people named in the bill of sale even set foot on the land which is now the campus of Goucher College. If we could know for sure that Holliday bought these enslaved people and that they lived at Epsom, it would greatly increase the relevance of the source to Goucher College, as well as giving Goucher's administration a list of names which could be useful in some sort of possible commemoration. What we can learn from this bill of sale is that there were 13 enslaved people who were sold from one man to another. They had names, lives, and families. It is our duty as human beings to commemorate them and the horrors they lived through. We can do that through recognizing them and speaking about them here, and giving them the respect that they deserve. We can also recognize that the reason we wish we knew more about them is due to the imbalance of power here. We as historians have a lot of information about people like Buchanan, and even a bit of information about the life of John Robert Holliday due to the fact that they were relatively high-ranking, wealthy members of society, but we have little about the people they enslaved because any information that concerned them was deemed, at one point or another, not worth keeping around. The slaves mentioned in the document probably couldn't write anything about themselves, so we are dependent on reading anything written about them. I hope that one day a different group of researchers picks up this project and looks at what their lives might have been like. A good idea might be to look at where slaves in this area were commonly sold to, as well as if it is really possible for women and children to have some role in an industrial slavery environment. This desire to find out who these people were and how they lived is perhaps one that we cannot solve right now, but it is one that should be elaborated on in the future. This is their story, not Buchanan or Holliday's. And at the end of the day, if any of them set foot on what is now the campus of Goucher College, we have the duty to remember them and find their stories. I'm going to turn it over to Debbie now so she can tell us a little bit about the research process.
First, I would like to thank everyone at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, especially the library staff. Kate, Mallory, Sandra, Micah, who's a Goucher alum, and Francis. I also would like to thank Leslie and Joe in Imaging Services, who scan the images for our presentations, and Martha, who is our host this evening. We appreciate your knowledge and support over the past year. My role tonight is to talk about the research process. When the students and I visited the library most Thursday afternoons during the fall semester, we pored over 18th century documents, personal correspondence, ledgers, business papers, each of us hoping to find some clues about who lived or worked on the land. We did not have a research question per se, but a goal to learn more about the enslaved men and women and children who lived, loved, and labored on the land that is now Goucher College. So where did we start? We used search terms in the library catalog that were related to the family and the land: Holliday, Ridgely, and of course Epsom. We have secondary sources at our disposal right here at the Goucher College Library, books about Baltimore history, online databases, and websites that all provided both clues to other collections, as well as context about the time period and the families who own the land. We also have access to previous research conducted by Goucher professor Kent Lancaster, who began researching the land in 1977. His historic preservation class, and one student in particular, Susan Cook, presented their findings in the inventory form for a state historic site survey submitted to the Maryland Historical Trust in 1978. Professor Lancaster and his historic preservation classes continued researching both Epsom Plantation and Hampton National Historic Site until he retired in 2000. In 2011, a local metal detector enthusiast who had permission to be on campus in the 1980s returned Epsom artifacts to Goucher Special Collections, inspiring a new generation of faculty and student research concerning the history of the landscape. In 2012, under the guidance of Professor Tina Scheller, an historic preservation class researched Epsom, the home as a structure, as well as the history of the Chew family during the 19th century when it was owned by Henry Banning Chew and his wife, Harriet Ridgely Chew. In 2017-2018, that academic year, students continued their research in the 19th century, focusing on land use and those who lived and worked on the plantation, the enslaved and free African Americans and other laborers. Because of this research, particularly the work of student Hannah Lane, we now know more names of the enslaved workers and some information about who they were. These secondary sources were certainly helpful for context and research clues. Our focus this past year was on the era of John Robert Holliday when he was connected to the land from 1760 to about 1800 when he died. Interestingly, a student paper from the 1970s very much states what we all felt, and I quote, "This manuscript work has been discouraging at times, especially since there are no Holliday papers. 45 years later, and there have been no newly processed collections of papers related to Holliday. We face these difficulties by going through side doors and back doors. It's difficult to find information about the lives of enslaved people because those who leave their papers to posterity are typically the wealthy and powerful, not those who were bought and sold." We were further challenged by the lack of documentation related to Holliday himself. What few papers he left behind were connected to business and family members. For example, a handwritten copy of Holliday's will is located in manuscript 219, the Carroll McCubbin papers, simply because James Carroll was the executor of his will. We examined several collections that were mentioned in the research notes, but manuscript 2865, the Baltimore County chattel records, were not listed as a source that I could find in the research notes. So why did we choose this collection? Because the collection fits the topic and the time frame. The ledger we used with the bill of sale that you saw previously was dated from 1785 to 1788. I was familiar with this collection and knew the ledgers were filled with critical information, such as names, dates, places that may not be found elsewhere. We were presented with the ledger, a large volume that was carefully placed in a cradle. Its age was apparent, and it was a very heavy volume. We heard the binding creak ever so quietly when we opened it. When we turned the pages, we felt the thickness of each page and know the difference compared to today's thin and fragile paper. We saw the cursive handwriting, the imperfections in the pages, and the small stains that appear with age, wear, and tear. And we even smelled a subtle mustiness that comes with older materials. It was a sensory experience and even an emotional experience. One of my favorite historians, Henry Wensick, describes the experience of working with a similar ledger in his book, The Hairstons, An American Story in Black and White, which was published in 1999. His narrative intertwines the stories of both Black and white family members over centuries. One of his sources is a ledger that contains a list of names and their values, and he calls it a bank book of souls. I have to agree with that description. The research process is an emotional journey, and I hope the students felt supported in their work as well as through the process. At the end of our research this past year, we added more context to the story by looking at slave law in Maryland. We researched names of those who had business ties to John Robert Holliday and learned more about his business dealings and partnerships with McClure, Buchanan, Goodwin, and Lux, and found that several of the men married Ridgely women, and therefore they were not only business partners, but family members. But I'm most proud of the research that added 13 individual names and their ages 4 months to 50 years to the historical record. Bet, Press, Sal, Hezekiah, Nathaniel, Rosetta, Osmond, Matilda, Caesar, Alfonso, Edmund, Nan, Indiana. I say their names to honor and remember them. Thank you. And now I think it's time for some questions and answers.
Thanks, Debbie and James and Joey and Kalman. If for those of you who are watching at home, take a few minutes and please type any questions you might have for our students or for Debbie and James into the Q&A box, and we will answer them. I did see one question came in, which was asking about the general public's use of the library. And again, we are referring mostly in this presentation to the H. Furlong Baldwin Library at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Debbie might be able to talk about the accessibility of the Goucher Library, but the MCHC library, the H. Furlong Baldwin Library, is open to researchers. We have a long list of information to help you plan your visit on our website, which is linked in the answer that I typed to Carolyn. We have one question that just came in, and to all of you, feel free to chime in, as you see fit. So Rita is asking, is there a next step to further this research?
Yeah, I think, the thing that was so amazing about this project was, as we all kind of mentioned, how hard it was to find information about Holliday and how that led us nonetheless to certain names. And what I think the future research is just more time and energy dedicated to figuring out, who was involved in this Epsom project and what were the business connections and people that we can then trace in these various property records. Because ultimately our mission for us is just finding those names of the enslaved and where they went and where they ended up, right? And so we still don't have a full accounting of all of the names of the enslaved people who lived and labored on Epsom in the 19th century. We have a good sense around a certain period, but we're not sure quite after about 1840. We don't know those names. We still don't know the extensiveness of Holliday's business transactions, we haven't gone through all of the chattel records. And so, there's going to be a lot more energy that's needed to sort of focus and continue this project. And I think it's going to be an ongoing one. And it's going to span, different periods of time, not only the 18th century as we kind of focused on, but there's a lot more to do in the 19th century as well. I think a lot of those records are going to be up here in Philadelphia. And so there's going to be a lot more work that's going to be done in the future of that. I don't know about Debbie, Joey, or Kalman. Did you have anything to say about, at least maybe for your own personal point of view, where you think needs to be researched more or next?
Well, from the library perspective or the archive perspective, we will be doing some more of the background as, creating an annotated bibliography, a LibGuide or a subject guide, depending on where you are, that will be placed on the website so that people can see more of the research and be able to move it into a direction that they want, because they'll see what the research has already been done in historiography, basically. And back to what Martha was saying earlier, Goucher Special Collections is open to the public. We just ask for an appointment. So you will have access to the materials that we have here. We do not have original materials before the college purchased the land in 1921. So we have photocopies from the 1970s from materials at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And we have some scans, but they are not ours. We don't have the permissions, but we can share that information with you. So I just want to make that clear, because we've had people come in here saying, I want to look at an 18th century document. We don't have it. So, but I can certainly help with that. So I'll put in the chat, if you want to make an appointment, it's archives@goucher.edu.
Joey or Kalman, did you want to say anything about, maybe from your own perspective, what's next or what's needed?
I know there's been talks of memorial or commemoration of this project and those who are enslaved on the land. And I'm hopeful that's a step we can take now that names have been unearthed. And I know recently a local private school, McDonough, has unveiled a memorial for those who were enslaved under the founder of the school, McDonough. And so I'm hoping we can maybe follow in those footsteps. And although I'll be graduating, I hope that there can be some more permanent legacy of this research at Goucher, so the history is not forgotten yet again.
Yeah. All right, we don't want to, Kalman, did you have anything to add, or should we go into some other questions? Because there's more questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, we can go on for sure. Yeah, we can take another question.
I see
Joey, well, just real quickly, I'm glad you mentioned McDonough and the statue that was just unveiled. Someone else in the Q&A box mentioned that, and was so for anybody who hasn't seen, there was a statue that is honoring the enslaved people who worked for the McDonough family, and basically helped them acquire that wealth to then start the school. So I'd urge you all to look at that. We are going to be sending a follow-up email after this program. It has been recorded, and we'll send the recording, and then we'll also send some more resources for, the Goucher project, visiting both libraries, but then also some other projects that are happening around the Baltimore area that are looking at roots of enslavement and legacy of slavery, which I mentioned at the beginning of the program, many organizations are looking at more and more, which is exciting.
So do you want me to go through the questions, or? Okay,
sure. Yeah. If you see one, go for it.
Yeah. So Barbara asked, where's the kiln found by Professor Lancaster? He taught Asian history in the 1960s. He taught Barbara Asian history in the 1960s. So there's a little, the kiln is hidden in plain sight, and I'm a little hesitant to say where it is because it's kind of really dangerous to go to, actually. It's amazing to see. But we really don't want too many people visiting it. It's kind of hidden in a gully. It's surrounded by thorns and thickets, and one day we really hope to raise enough money to buttress it and make sure that it wouldn't hurt anybody, because it is kind of buried, like I said, in a gully, and you can potentially kind of stand on it, and parts of the stone can fall apart. So we try not to yet really talk about precisely where it is, because we don't want too many people to go visit it. But I assure you that if you've driven on campus in the Loop, you've passed by it numerous times and just never knew. And so if you do want a personal tour, you could message Debbie or I, and one day we could go out and put our boots on and take you out there. But it is a really remarkable site. So let's see a question from Steve K. About Steve says he volunteers at the William Paca House in Annapolis. In 1763, Paca married a woman whose maiden name was Chu. Didn't I hear the name Chu mentioned in your talk? Yes. So the Chu family, what happens is in the 19th century, a man named Henry Banning Chu marries into the Ridgely family. And by virtue of that marriage, I believe the year is 1829, I could be wrong, he inherits Epsom back from the Ridgely family, along with a number of over 24 enslaved people. Now, the Chu family is even, if the Ridgely family is the most powerful family or one of the wealthiest families in all of Maryland, the Chu family is equally powerful and extremely influential in the state of Pennsylvania. But I believe, and Debbie can correct me on this, that their roots actually are traced to Virginia. So it's very possible that, the Chu that was in Annapolis that Steve mentions was somehow connected to the Chus of Pennsylvania, or possibly a descendant of the Chus that had migrated from an earlier period of time. So we're not quite sure about that connection. But again, I think what all of this underscores is just how deeply enmeshed family connections are to the system of slavery in the United States, right? Like that these powerful families that were engaged in slave trading and property holding were passing on these individuals through their family connections, and then by virtue of that, making their heirs wealthy, right? And how interdependent those two processes were. Debbie, did you have anything to add to this? Because you're the real Maryland historian here.
I wouldn't doubt that the families are related, because the Chu family went, I think in the 1600s, went from Virginia to Maryland, but they're the Chus of Annapolis. They moved over to the Eastern Shore. They lived in Chestertown, which is in Kent County, before they went to Kent County in Delaware, and then eventually made their way to Clifton, just outside Philadelphia. Charles Carroll Jr. of Homewood married Harriet Chu, who I believe is Henry Banning Chu's aunt, but they are related. And then I believe John Eager Howard of Belvedere in Baltimore also married a Chu. So it's an interesting, definitely a powerful families marrying powerful families. And I'm not totally surprised by that.
And Debbie, did you want to take the next question? Jenny asked about where do we find the Baltimore County chattel records?
There are 3 volumes at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. It's under manuscript 2865. There is also a 2865.1 and 0.2. There are restrictions on several of them due to conditions. So there are 2 that we did not have access to. One was on loan and now restricted for conservation purposes. But the Maryland State Archives has a whole series of other volumes. Most of the volumes are there. We didn't focus too much on the sources through the Maryland State Archives by going there, simply because our partner in this grant is the Maryland Center for History and Culture. So that was the focus of our work. And I look forward to going down to the state archives to definitely see more information.
Okay, great. And I should say that I believe I went on the Maryland State Archives website just a few days ago, like a couple of weeks ago, and they had digitized like the index from the chattel records, and Holliday's name appeared multiple times in the chattel records. So, who's to say? Kim asked, is there land set apart on campus? I'm not sure what you mean by set apart, if you're talking about a memorial or if you mean that the campus is somehow apart from this. But really, from the image I showed in the very beginning, the campus where Goucher currently is, almost all of it was Epsom. There's some interesting questions about boundary lines, particularly to the east side. But virtually all of that was Epsom Plantation, or sometimes called Epsom Farm. We have not, if the question was about setting apart land on campus for memorial, no, we haven't even gotten that far. As Joey kind of mentioned, there's this desire to do the memorial, but as a historian, my instinct is, let's not talk about the memorial until we know we have every name, because, and this is very, very difficult work, and it's going to take a lot of time. So I would say that, but hopefully one day we're going to make it happen. So that was a good question, Kim. Have the names of any of the enslaved at Epsom been connected to people living today? Is any additional ethnographic work being planned? We truly, truly hope to do this, and that would be wonderful. I know that Hampton has engaged in that and has made some of those connections, I believe, and we would love to do that. I can say that while we would be very excited, and that's a desire to do it, it's going to be real. I suspect it's going to be very, very challenging. And nonetheless, I think we might be able to do it the more we understand Epsom in the 19th century. So those whatever records we can find, particularly, leading up to abolition, right before slavery is abolished in the United States, those are going to be the most important for that particular question, I think, because we might be able to do that then. But again, that work has not yet been conducted, and hopefully in the future there's going to be more folks at Goucher and in the broader community who can help us do that work. So the connection again, between Epsom Farm and the Ridgely and the Gilmore Farm. This is it is so amazing to me as a historian to see how deeply interconnected all of these families are. And, what I'm really starting to think about this entire project is that we need, as a society, as a state, as a community, to essentially develop a big database where we can begin to figure out names of people and associate those with different family holdings, and then be able to cross-tabulate and see these connections and potentially trace who moves from what site to what site. I've done this kind of thing in my own research in the Caribbean on small places and looking at these kind of things. But I can say at the scale that we're talking, it's going to require a lot of funding. It's going to require a lot of support, but I really think that would be an amazing step forward as a community, to begin to establish some sort of database of records in that regard. And it will be imperfect because, again, enslaved people were denied the right to name themselves oftentimes. And so the names that they took on when they were freed could be completely disconnected from the experience they had when they were enslaved. And so those are some tricky connections to make, but nonetheless, I think if we as a community want to do something like that, we should begin to think about how to document it collectively and how to create a kind of crowdsourced database in that regard. Okay. Lots of questions. I keep generating more questions. This is good. I hope I don't answer them all. Does anybody want to, is there any questions anyone else wants to answer? Because I can answer the other, I'll answer them all day.
I don't see any questions in my chat.
You got to use open the Q&A on the on the thing. It's okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
So. So how's the Hallowed Ground project being used to help other universities across the country? Well, the current director of the project, Alexandra Jones, is really well known. She's an archaeologist and she's really leading the project. And she just attended the University Studying Slavery conference. So I believe it started in Virginia. There's a consortium of colleges and universities who are doing really similar work, and they're kind of all connected to do sort of support with that. And as we know, I think a lot of this work is gaining a lot more attention, especially in the past couple of years. So that's a very good question.
I can answer Carol Brooks.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, I'm sorry, Carol. Hi, Carol. Is there any further research or findings around the Goucher land and indigenous inhabitants who were there before the Ridgely Epsom narrative took place? Yes and no. So the college is actively working on a land acknowledgement. We are part of a multi-institutional working group. And next week we are meeting with an elder of the Piscataway to do some of this, to be part of this process. And it's been ongoing for about a year right now. So it's a very detailed process because it's a non-indigenous land acknowledgement. Therefore, the work has to be done by the settlers and the colonists. It is not the work of the indigenous community. So we have been working, it's the BMA, the Walters, Towson University, and a total of 11 institutions have been working on this for about a year. So with that, it's not just the land acknowledgement as the end of the process. It's actually the very beginning of the process. It is establishing relationships with indigenous communities and creating programs and a relationship in which is beneficial to the indigenous community. So we are in that process, which also includes education, which can be either classes, lectures, exhibits, things like that. So we're at the beginning stages of the land acknowledgement part.
Great. And I see some familiar names in the Q&A. So yeah, Linda Shopes mentions Clivenden in Germantown, Pennsylvania, again, relating to the Chew family. And someone did ask how to spell Chew. You spell it C-H-E-W. And so thanks, Linda, for that reminder. Greg Weidman from Hampton mentions Packa's wife and the Chews of West River, Anne Arundel County. Benjamin Chew, who founded the Chews of Philadelphia, was from the same county family. So the Philadelphia Chews who married into the Carrolls, Howards, and Ridgeleys were originally from Maryland, right? And then I think that's it. We got a yes to my database idea. So wonderful. Let's do it. Let's figure out how to do it. I think that's all the questions and all the comments. Right.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I did just put a quick, easy to answer survey and feedback form in the chat. Like I mentioned, I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email after this program with some of the resources and things that we all talked about. I'm going to let our friends from Goucher just say any last words they'd like to say, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody.
I just want to thank everybody for coming out. It's really great. And it's great to see all the people in the Q&A and get feedback. And please fill out the survey. We actually, because this was grant funded, they really want you to answer that survey. So that's important for me to file some paperwork. And I don't know, Debbie, Kalman, Joey, do you have anything to say?
Thank you so much. It was great to hear some responses to our research, and we hope it will be a continuing conversation, and we're not done with this research yet.
All right.
I'd like to again thank everyone for coming, and I'd also just like to thank Professor Dator and Debbie for helping us students out with this project. It's been really great, and getting to learn all this about the land that I'm on right now has been just such an experience. So thank you to everyone involved.
It was an absolute pleasure working with this group. It was definitely an experience and so much more to do, but we were a good team. So thank you. And thank you to everyone out there.
Thanks most of all to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. You all are awesome. I love you. Thank you.
It's exciting to see people coming in and doing history. That's the purpose of having collections like this, is for people to explore them and uncover new information and new perspectives to help understand our world. So it's fun to see it come full circle and have presentations from students and get to be on screen with you all. So Thanks again. Thanks all around. I hope everyone has a great night, and we'll see you again soon, I hope.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.